Welcome everybody to the Spring 2022 lecture series of the School of Architecture and Design at New York Institute of Technology. I'm Alessandro Melis, the chair of the Lectures and Events Committee, and would like to welcome everybody on behalf of Dean Maria Pervellini, who is promoting this series of initiatives regarding the engagement within communities, policies, and activities. Today's event is exceptionally interesting from my perspective and also engaging within the discourse about communities, as it offers opportunity to discuss the topic in a very original, energetic, and inspiring manner. I'm particularly grateful to our students who have proposed and organized this event, and I'm particularly grateful and honored to have today with us Wandile Mthiyane and also I'm grateful with Wandile too for having accepted our invitation. Before leaving the stage to Wandile, I would like to take the chance to introduce the curators of the event. As I said, our students. Julia Andor is a fourth-year student in the 5-year Bachelor of Architecture program and the president of the American Institute of Architecture Students at the Long Island campus. She's involved in the AIAS both at our school and on national level as a national advocate for unhoused people and as a member of a non-profit organization's governance committee. She has also recently been elected as the 2022-2023 AIAS Northeast Quadrant Director and will serve the architecture school in the Northeast while completing her architectural thesis next year. Elisa Park is a second-year architecture student and president and founding member of the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students on the Long Island campus, as well as secretary and advocacy committee chair of the American Institute of Architectural Students, New York Tech, Long Island. She is also involved in the national AIAS as a member of the Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. Elisa is interested in reaching how people are affected by the built environment and how architects can learn to become more socially aware and equitable to serve the communities that they work with. Vanessa Alvarez is a fourth-year student in the Bachelor of Architecture program. He is currently involved in the work-study program with the School of Architecture and Design's marketing team for lectures and events. Vanessa is planning to apply for an internship with the New York City Department of City Planning this summer. So thank you very much for the organization of the event. Julia, Elise, and Vanessa, I leave the stage to you, and thank you very much once more.
Okay, or Wandile, do you want me to run the video now?
Yes, if the next thing is me speaking, yes.
But I think that Julia is not presenting first the...
Julia?
Sure. Wandile, did you want me to read your bio or did you want to use the video instead?
You can read my bio.
Sure. So we'll do both?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure. Awesome.
Yeah, that works.
So we're very excited today to introduce Wandile. Wandile is an Obama leader, dynamic speaker, equity and inclusion thought leader, adjunct professor, and architect who holds a master's degree in architecture from Andrews University in Michigan. He's a Resolution Fellow, a One Young World Ambassador, and the CEO of a social impact architecture firm, Ubuntu Design Group. Ubuntu Design Group, the anti-racist Hotdog, and the Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad Design Justice School. Diversity and inclusion are core themes for Wandile in serving his purpose as an architect and a DEI guide, as a result of his upbringing and life experiences. He was born during apartheid in South Africa, attended a high school in Zimbabwe, and then went on to complete his bachelor's and master's degree in architecture at the most ethnically diverse university in the United States, Andrews University in the state of Michigan.
Thank you very much.
Screen share now? Should I play the video? Yeah, okay, good.
What is home? I was born into an environment shaped by apartheid, and I've been struggling with the concept of home since I was a child. I want to give the next generation of kids the experience of home that I never had.
Ubuntu Design Group changes the ways we look at informal settlements, co-designing communities, and putting the people as the lead architect of their community and homes.
We believe that no one knows best where they're going to live than the person who's actually going to live there.
I never really had a place to call home. In a selfish way, I'm doing what I'm doing to find out what home is. Apartheid architecture pushed a certain group of people
They've put up and pulled down RDP houses 4 times.
into sort of the worst conditions.
These contractors that aren't really building proper houses. I mean, the houses don't even last 5 years.
In government setting, there's a lot of people with money who come and throw money into the problem.
A lot of money is being wasted currently.
You've got to start seeing it as being something which builds from the bottom, because that is socially sustainable.
Why am I doing this?
So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I don't know if it's just me, but I think on my end I couldn't hear the audio of the video, which is great. It helps us imagine what we were saying in that video. So we'll get right to it and hopefully fill in some of those gaps. I'm going to share my screen right now. And maybe before I share my screen, I just want to say I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for having me. Yeah, hopefully this is going to be fun. I just want to have a conversation with you about houses and hot dogs and anti-racism and architecture. So let's see how all of these things come together. Yeah, let me share my screen. There we go. Maybe to start, I think you can't talk about architecture without first talking about leadership. I think every architect is in a position of power. Every architect is in a position of leadership, whether we like it or not. The lines that we draw impact people's lives, even beyond our own lifetime. So for me to understand leadership, I learned a lot from President Barack Obama. In 2019, I had the privilege of meeting President Obama. I just been awarded I had become an Obama Fellow. And I promise in this photo, I am in this photo, but I don't know what I did to the photographer, but they just cropped me out. I was just to the right of where the crop is. And so we're in Chicago, and he said something that was very fascinating that I've never forgot since. He said when he was at the White House, he would have all these type A students from all the top universities, such as yours, come and intern during the summer. And towards the end of the summer, he would have a fireside chat where we would bring them all together and have a Q&A and have a conversation with them before they go back to their schools. And what would happen, which was very fascinating, was that they would all ask him questions, but inevitably someone will ask, so how do I become president? And Obama chuckles and says, well, when I was in college in Columbia or at Oxy or even at Harvard at some point, he's like, I wasn't thinking about becoming president. He's like, I was probably chasing girls or reading about Nelson Mandela and learning about the movement in South Africa with apartheid and seeing how young people were standing up to change their country. So what's ended up happening, which was very fascinating, was that so I wasn't thinking about these things, but by learning about apartheid and learning about what Nelson Mandela was doing, learning about what Mahatma Gandhi was doing, I was able to start realizing that I also have a responsibility towards my community. I also have a responsibility to bring about change within my spheres of influence. And he said something that was very fascinating. He said, you can't change a country without first being able to change a province or a state. You can't change a state without being able to change a city. You can't change a city without being able to change a neighborhood, and you can't change a neighborhood without first being able to change yourself. And this idea that leadership begins with us, and it begins with what you can do. It begins with the person you're sitting next to in studio during crits, right? It begins with the type of projects that you choose to engage in. And then that grows to you going to an architecture firm or government or whatever work, and how you choose to use your skill set. Are you using your skill set to divide, or are you using your skill set to bring people together? Or are you intentionally being oblivious about the impact of your work? But either way, whatever you do goes on to have an impact on others. And how do we then start intentionally using that power for good? And this idea that that change begins with us. And he says something very profound after that. He says, we cannot wait for some other person or some other time, because we are the change that we seek. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. You know, growing up in South Africa in different places, you know, at different points in my life, I would wait for my parents to be the ones who would bring about change, or I'd wait for my teachers to be the ones to bring about change, or my professors, or right now I would wait for the government, etc. But throughout all of these different stages, I've still seen a lot of broken systems. I've still seen a lot of issues that haven't been changed by quote unquote the powers that be. But when we actually look at the people who've actually gone on to change the world, they were regular people like us, right? We look at folks like Nelson Mandela, we look at folks like Martin Luther King, and we ascribe leadership to this elite few and feel like we are not leaders. But what we forget is that, like all of us in this chat, Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, they were born in a normal hospital in actually worse conditions than us, had parents, went to school. And through a series of the small choices they decided to make, it's led them to leading the civil rights movement or ending apartheid. And I think the problem with us as architects and as young leaders coming up is we often want to compare ourselves to the pinnacle of these people's lives rather than to the process that they were invested in order for them to be able to reach that part of bring about change. So as we start this lecture, if you forget anything that I said, I want you to remember that we are the ones we've been waiting for, and we are the change that we seek. We cannot wait for some other time or for some other person, because we are the ones. Children around the world love to play house. And growing up in Durban, South Africa, my friends and I were no different. Well, except our houses were too small to play house in. So what would happen is we would all come together and we'll gather our scrap metals and leftover materials, and we'll build a little shack right next to our family's home. And this will fall on us, and we'll try again through trial and error. We'll eventually have a slightly sturdy building that we can play in. And then we'll all run to our respective homes, one to run steal beans, another steals rice, another spices, and then we'll come back and we'll cook in our little playhouse. In retrospect, this is not the most fire-safe things to do, so do not do this at home. But the food tasted good, and it is these experiences that went on to shape my childhood. See, in my community, there was no architect because everyone was an architect. Whenever a new member came in, the communities come together and build a home for them using the leftover materials that were there. So we didn't have the most fancy or trending toys, but we had each other. And it was in this experience that I learned the importance of being resourceful, the importance of working together, and the importance of cooking food that we had stolen from our homes in our little playhouse. And even though this was really fun for me and my friends, as you can tell, I was a tad lighter skinned back then. A few things have changed since. Even though this was really fun for me and my friends, it wasn't necessarily fun for my parents, because they had to think about what happens if there's a heavy rainstorm. I'm not sure if you saw in the New York Times, there's been a heavy rainstorm in Durban about 3 weeks ago. Over 400 people lost their lives due to poor living conditions. So if there's a heavy rainstorm, what is going to happen to us? or if there's a heavy wind, the house could fall on us. So they didn't have the same worries that I did. And through that, realizing that a lot of the challenges that were happening within my communities with due to housing, I vowed to myself that I want to go and study architecture so that I can be the change that I want to see and use architecture as a vehicle to bring about change within my community. Because what we realized was that at the center and core of low-income housing or of problems within low-income communities was the lack of dignified housing. Without a dignified house, a person doesn't have a physical address. Without a physical address, you cannot apply for a job. Without a job, you cannot have money. Without money, you can build a home, which creates this vicious cycle. Without a home, a dignified home, kids don't have a place to do homework, which affects education. Without a home, you're living in a mud brick home with moist. So certain family members may struggle with asthma as a result of some of those poor living conditions. You start realizing that at the center of a lot of challenges within these low-income communities was the lack of dignified housing. So that's why I wanted to study architecture and focus on that. So I went to Andrews University in Michigan. This is me graduating with my undergrad back in 2016. And I remember being very excited to go to college, thinking to myself, like, I'm about to change the world, learn architecture and use it as a vehicle for change. But I quickly realized when I was in college that architecture was often viewed as a commodity for the rich. And every time you try to design for low-income communities, folks saw it not as quite architecture if you're designing for low-income communities. And there was this false notion, particularly which is prevalent in the West, this idea that people choose to be poor, right? They choose to live in informal settlements, they choose to live in shacks, and they ought to pull themselves out by their bootstraps. Which was ironic because I had come from those environments and nothing could be further from the truth. And there was also this idea that people are lazy or uncreative, who come from low-income communities. But in reality, a lot of the buildings that we inhabit are built by blue-collar workers who come from these low-income communities. And the only difference between us and them is that they don't have the privilege of resources to be able to build the same dignity of homes for themselves as they do for us. And as a protest, I started the Ubuntu Design Group with the idea that architecture plus people equals community. And pushing back to sort of our school's curriculum, but also really living up to why I had gone to architecture school in the first place, which was to use architecture as a vehicle to bring about change within my communities. You see, people, the fundamental concept around what we're doing at Ubuntu is that people living in informal settlements are some of the most creative individuals in the world. When you look at this image, for instance, you're seeing a house that is built literally out of everything. There's a tire, there's a microwave, there's a chair, there's rocks, there's mud brick, there's plywood, there's corrugated steel. Literally all of these materials brought together to make a home. If we were given the same materials, I'm not sure we'd be able to create a home out of it, right? So these are some of the most resourceful and most creative individuals in the world. They just lack the same level of privilege we have to have access to resources to be able to build more steady, dignified homes. So what I wanted to do was, I wanted to partner with this community and harness this creativity and bring in some of the architectural knowledge I had on spatial planning, on structure, on different principles that I could add value to the community so that we can design contextual communities that will enable everyone to thrive. So in doing that, when I started the Ubuntu Design Group and started doing the work, Andrews University's Master's Architecture School decided to change their whole master's program to focus on the work that I was doing. So I started doing this work with Andrews University MR class. And as we're doing research, we started looking at different affordable housing models across time. And we realized that majority of the models had failed. on affordable housing. And as we dug deeper, we realized that there are three things that's led to the failure of a lot of affordable housing projects. So number one, affordable housing projects were often built away from economic centers. So they would move people from these informal settlements and build homes away from these economic centers, which is ironic because the only reason why you have shanty towns or informal settlements is because people are trying to move closer to work. So that's one of the reasons why these failed. Number two, they're often built as these 40 square meter boxes that are almost impossible for families to add on to or to grow beyond that particular socioeconomic bracket or as they grow in number. So that was the second major reason that they failed. And then the last, and also one of the most important reasons, is that they failed because for some reason, when architects design for low-income communities, they believe that they should not consult the end user who are actually going to live there, which is ironic because the whole process of design and architecture is anchored in feedback from the client. In fact, we are the vehicle to bring the life of what the client is looking for. But when it comes to low-income communities, we think we know best how they're going to live. So these were three main issues that came from us doing research on why affordable housing projects had failed. Now, let's put that aside. What was fascinating in this process was, I remember we were in class, and I think it was third year urban studies class, and we were talking about how do you, for example, in New York City, design a maybe a skyscraper building, residential mixed use that's high end, whilst also accommodating low end clients so that you don't gentrify the city. So how can you have a high end residential building with a 30% affordable component to it? So when we were doing that, one student raised their hand, a student from Singapore, and says, oh, I don't want to design a building with the low income group as part of it because I don't want to live next to bombs. Now, as you can imagine, it's created an uproar in class, mainly between me and him, partly because it goes back to that notion that folks or people choose to be poor. And this idea that we prejudge people based on conditions that they didn't choose. And also labeling folks and removing them of their dignity just because of the conditions of their financial conditions at the time. So the class ended in disruption from that series. But what ended up happening was fascinating. We ended up having this student come with us to South Africa and work with us. This was third year, but 3 years later, during the masters, we had him come with us and work with us in South Africa. So the apartheid, so in South Africa, there was an additional layer, there was an additional layer of apartheid architecture. Now, apartheid architecture was designed to enable a small group of South Africans to succeed, which is white South Africans, and the native Black South Africans to essentially to be devoid of economic opportunities and to be basically servants and work for the white apartheid oppressive regime. What they did was they designed this thing called the 40-40 rule, where they built a 40 square meter home, sort of like labor camps, and they located it 40 kilometers away from town, right? Which then forced Black communities to spend 40% of their income commuting to work, right? Which then disenfranchised them from being able to develop their own communities. And then in addition to that, they built these giant beer halls. So when they emasculated the men and taken their land and their dignity and their rights, and they work in these factories, when they would finish from the factories, they built giant beer halls right next to the factories. Frustrated as they were, they would take their money and drink it, which further disenfranchised Black communities, and they used the taxes from the beer to fund apartheid, which was happening in these townships. I think Churchill puts it best when he says, "We shape our buildings, but thereafter they shape us." And this idea that architecture is never neutral is anarchy also it hurts. I think this is a clear example of what happens when architecture is maliciously used to oppress. But this is not something obviously unique to South Africa. America had its own with redlining, and the curation of the GI Bill, and Levittown. So what happened in America is, post-World War veterans being given opportunity to sort of build homes after serving their country, which was directly made to serve the white veterans rather than the Black. And it was state mandated to for developers who would get funding to have this legislation that barred Black people from being able to buy in certain locations, even if they had the money. So both social housing and private development was directly designed so that Black families wouldn't be able to enter the housing market. Hence the creation of ghettos and the Black low-income communities that we see today. Now, in the 1940s, 50s, I think around that time, if you bought a house for like $7,000 in Levittown, it's worth $500,000 today. So all these white working class families were given the privilege and opportunity in one of the most consistent ways of accumulating wealth, which is real estate, to do that over all these years. What does this mean? It means that because of the wealth generation, white parents could send their kids to college. They could sell their home and put a down payment towards another home. They could take a loan from the bank against the home that's worth $500,000 that they own. And then we're quick to look at low-income Black communities and like, oh, they're just not working hard enough, right? I think it's important to understand, for us to understand that for the most part, meritocracy is a myth. We can work hard enough, and because of societal injustices and the structures that exist, our hard work will not result to the same results, right? I can work hard and make great. I know a lot of hardworking people who are tenacious, who are dedicated, but they do not have the same wealth as Bill Gates because their mom were not friends with the person who ran IBM, and they didn't have the friends and family round of seed funding of over $500,000 to start Microsoft, and then being able to have the right skin tone to be able to enter Silicon Valley, et cetera, right? So these structural injustices that exist, which creates these barriers, and that's what we need to change. But my focus today is helping architects realize that we are at the center of perpetuating racism and structural injustices. We may not be the ones who write the policies or the laws, but we are the ones that enact them. So when you look at these two images, up top it's the labor camp townships in South Africa. Below it's the sort of projects in America. The only difference is America just made it dense and went high because they were inspired by Le Corbusier. And then South Africa just spread it out because they had more land. But similar challenges. And when we look at these communities devoid of economic opportunities, devoid of parks, devoid of good schooling, devoid of all the true amenities that enable children to succeed in life and to thrive, we look at them on CNN and say, oh, what's wrong with those people? no, what's wrong with the architects who designed those places? Because those people are merely living up to the design, which were designed for them to fail. As Churchill put it, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. So we went to South Africa. We wanted to overhaul what's known as the process within affordable housing. We wanted to do the opposite of what had been done. So instead of not listening to people, we wanted to listen to build. So this is us meeting with high school students. This is us meeting with grandmas, or they call them gogos in South Africa, having town hall meetings, and letting the families and the communities be the lead designs of their homes, because no one knows best where they're going to live than the people who are actually going to live there. And just the amount of ingenuity and insight that we were able to get into the community was incredible, because it then easily shaped the design process moving forward. So this is us walking around with Izindunas. Izindunas are the local chiefs on the left, as we're walking around showing us the particular community. And that's me talking to the architecture students at the Durban University of Technology, sort of getting an insight from them on how we can best shape their communities. And then building to enable. So it's not just about listening to build, but it's about building to enable. So on the left, you have sort of the continuation of sort of the apartheid housing boxes, but you can tell there isn't even a driveway. So this already discourages you from having a car. It discourages from moving up in society. You don't see any park, you don't see any school. So again, designing for failure. So what we did was, it's like we wanted to design a home that has an economic center. So could a home be more than just a home? Could it also be a place that enables commerce? So each home we build focusing on women-headed households who are entrepreneurs. We build a commercial space that enables a family to financially sustain themselves. And we build the home in such a way that it can grow over time and expand as the family grows in numbers. So it's built anticipating add-ons as the family grows. But it's not just about building to enable. It's about enabling Ubuntu or enabling community. So it's because it's never about a house. It's never about a school. It's never about the park. It's about all of these things coming together to create a vibrant, holistic neighborhood that enables its citizens to thrive. So it's all about these things coming together. But it's not just about them coming together as they would in Rome or as they would in New York. It's about them coming together in a very contextual, culturally sensitive way that is relative to the place that you're building in. And so this is some of the work that we did in terms of the urban design of this particular place, and as we're working with community. So these are before and after photos. I'll just go through them relatively quickly. But you realize that to add dignity to a place and to create accessibility actually doesn't take that much. It's just slight changes enabling for some of these things. So this is the before, and this is the after. See, now girls can walk freely coming in from school. Grandmas can sell their fresh fruit produce on the streets, and it's a holistic street that you want to be in. This to this, creating economic centers that don't just have a Walmart that suck all the money to America. How can we have both multinationals but also local retailers working together and creating an efficient public transportation system? How do we create community centers that could be used, multi-purpose community centers that could be used as churches, wedding places, places for funeral, and even rehabilitation places for folks struggling with alcoholism and drugs. But also in a very contextual Zulu way, you see, from the use of the grass thatch, and could a garden wall be more than just a garden wall? Could it also be a bench where people can sit and wait? Could the paving be more than just a paving? Could it be a place that enables commerce and dignity as folks work? So one of the interesting things about this, but when we're doing the master plan for this place, we realized that at the center here, a lot of the high school kids told us there's a lot of car accidents that's happened there. They've lost a lot of their friends because the cars be speeding in that particular area, and we worked with them in coming up with a solution. So this is what that master plan would look like. So made the streets a little bit narrow, created a crossing area, forcing the cars to slow down. But I think one of the most important, and then creating this mixed use sort of development with light industrial, creating employment for the youth there, creating a trade school. But I think what's important about this particular design and master plan is understanding that you can't take this and put it in Lansing, Michigan, and it works. It's inherently umbumbulu, it's inherently contextual, and it's real. And I think that's what good design does. It serves the purposes of that particular place and that particular people. Now, when we're doing the Ubuntu Home project, this is the first family, our pilot family that's Mr. and Mrs. Charlie. Mr. Charlie was in a car accident in 1997, so he's been in a wheelchair ever since. Mrs. Charlie was born with a leg. So it's a family living with disability. They had given away their 15-year-old son just due to the poor living condition. They had lost their home due to a mud brick storm that happened in Durban. They were living in a borrowed room when we met them. So this is their first day actually at their new home, Ubuntu home that they're in, as you can see in the smiles on their faces. So this is the home that we designed and built for them. Now, Mrs. Mcharlie had worked at a daycare. So the commercial space became a daycare. At opening, they had 18 kids, which means that 18 mothers could now go to work as they send their kids to school. They had tripled their income. Their 15-year-old son now had a bedroom they were living with them. And as a result of their income, they've expanded so much so that they've built a whole new facility for the daycare, and they've got about 30 kids now. So when you start realizing that how much impact just one dignified home that enables opportunity can have, not just on that particular family, but on the community as a whole. One of the unintended impacts of this project was very fascinating to me was we had students that came from the local University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I remember this group of white students pulling me aside and saying, hey, we wouldn't even otherwise driven by this community because of what we've been told about people that live here. But we've never felt more at home. We've never felt safe, more safer. Thank you for having us be a part of this project. And this was fascinating to me to see how something as simple as designing and building this home for a family in need was starting to heal some of those wounds of apartheid and of division and some of the false notions about the other by bringing people together to solve those problems and seeing how architecture can actually build bridges across racial lines in a country that's trying to heal from apartheid. So I thought that was really fascinating to see the impact of that. Now, the title of the conversation is From Houses to Hot Dogs. This is where we get to the hot dogs part. So 2020, October, I go to a restaurant in Durban, South Africa. A new public promenade had just been built for about 400 million rands by the city. And, public clubs will inhabit that particular space. And so I see a restaurant there on one of my jogs. It's like, oh man, I need to go check that restaurant out. So it's Saturday night, I'm too lazy to cook, so I go out to this restaurant. When I get there, I quickly realize that the demographics of the folks both spilling out of the restaurant and inside the restaurant does not represent the demographics of Durban. I was like, okay, cool. I guess my people haven't figured it out that, this restaurant's open. So I walk in, but as soon as I walk in, the manager says, oh, you can't eat here. And then I was like, that's odd. Why can't I eat here? And he says, well, are you a member? Now, I think, pause. Number one, he already knew that I wasn't a member before I even said that, right? So it's like, are you a member? I was like, no. I was like, no, I'm not a member. I didn't know you need to be a member to have dinner. I was like, can I have a day pass just so that I can have dinner? He's like, no day pass. I was like, okay. Now I'm starting to get visibly angry. I'm like, well, can I join the membership? And he says, well, to join the membership, you need to email this person who has to email that person, and then the committee will sit down and decide on their opinion whether or not you can be a member of this Durban Undersea Club. Huh, interesting. I was like, well, y'all messed with the wrong one. So I left, spent 2 days researching this institution. So of course, all whiteboard, read every minute, read their constitution. And how they'd done it was very fascinating because 27 years before this incident happened, this was a whites-only beach in South Africa. So my parents would have never been allowed to even go to the particular beach. So that's one. But what they'd done was create a constitution that directly bars a certain group of people based on their skin color and socioeconomic status from being able to come in. So there's 2 memberships. There's the Durban Undersea Club sports membership where you do scuba diving, etc. You know, as a Black man, we don't necessarily come from a very great culture of scuba diving. So I wasn't going to join that part. But there was the other side, which talked about, you know, just being able to eat there, the social membership. And the requirements for the social membership was you had to fill in your address, send in your photo, have 2 families who are part of the club co-sign for you, 2 separate families co-sign for you, and then pay 3,000 rands. And then a committee would sit down, and the only requirement was based on their opinion, will decide whether or not you can be a member of this club. So of course, naturally, all the Black people were on the waiting list and all the white people were part of the club. And it's interesting how they structured, this is a clear example of systemic racism, which is built on to the Constitution. How they structured it was, there was an economic barrier, right? There was an address so that they know which community you come from. There was your photo, and there was sort of like the social capital that you have by knowing other scuba diving families that have to co-sign for you. And then in addition to that, let's say if you pass all of those, there was still a barrier of this random white group of people coming together and deciding on their opinion whether or not you fit the caliber of person that should be a part of this club. And I was infuriated with this, thinking about, man, it's like, 28 years since Nelson Mandela became president, we still have to face things of this nature. So I thought about, how do I protest? How do I bring about change in this particular area? I looked at Black Lives Matter, I looked at all different protests, and I realized that a lot of protest takes away from the victim. So, for instance, protest you lose a day of work, you may lose your life, as evidenced by the Carl Rittenhouse case. So I wanted to create a protest that gave to the victim whilst also making a point. So we wrote an article talking about how spatial planning and apartheid continue today through such issues as this club. And, a lot of white South Africans were not happy. I remember on Facebook, one of the ladies commented on the article and said, if you don't like our restaurant or establishment, why don't you just start your own? I was like, man, that's actually a really good idea. So that's how the anti-racist hotdog was started. So we started the anti-racist hotdog as a direct process. We put it on top of the promenade, right on top of where that restaurant is located. And then we put banners across the bridge with anti-racist hotdog. We invited our friends who did the soundtrack for Black Panther to play house music. So it was hot dogs, house music, wine, and a dialogue around race. And we started seeing something which was very fascinating, where we started drawing crowds of people from different racial backgrounds, from different age groups, coming together to have this dialogue. And because of the setting of how we would host the anti-racist hot dog parties and events, people were a lot more willing to say what they thought and have very deep and meaningful conversation within that particular disarming setting. And then from there, that's when the idea behind like, how could we take this model of the anti-racist hot dog to both higher education and to architecture firms and workplaces, so that we can start transforming the culture? Because as clear as this is, clearly policies are not enough. We need to also change culture to create an anti-racist culture a workplace culture where everyone can bring their authentic selves and be able to reach their goals through social cohesion and uncommon pairs. And that's where we moved from just the anti-racist hot dog being these events in Durban, and President Obama tweeted about it, to us working with workplace cultures, where in workplace cultures and in universities, we work with both students and faculty, helping them understand the story of self through a narrative structure, the story of self, the story of us, and the story of others. The story of self being, what is my own relationship with race? What is my responsibility within that particular relationship with race? The story of us is like, what's the relationship of us as an architecture school within the broader discourse of race? And what are tools can we put in place to ensure that every student that comes to our architecture school feels a sense of belonging and well-being? And how does our curriculum start to reflecting those attributes? And then the story of others looks at how do we then use these tools that we have, and it trickles down to the projects that we assign our students, but also to the social impact that we have within the broader communities that we exist in. Story of self, story of us, and the story of others. And that's what the anti-racist hot dog is. And that's what it's about. So this is one of the events that we have, and folks out there sort of getting hot dogs, and those are the anti-racist hot dog shirts, which I'm wearing one right now as I'm talking to you all. That represents turning workplaces and turning schools into communities where we all belong. Some just images from some of the anti-racist hot dog events we've had. But thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I think that's the end of my lecture.
Thank you very much, Mandila. This was really inspiring. A lot of reflections that, yes, we can have from Julia. Do you want to start with the question? I don't know if you already, or we can ask if any of the present would like to make any question. How will you do?
Yeah, if anybody here has any questions and maybe you're a little shy to say them out loud, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions. We'll probably give it a second.
Congratulations, Julia, if I may speak. I'm sorry, I apologize for being in my car after a long day of meetings, but I think that at the risk of seeming informal in my car, I think it's more worth it to congratulate you personally for a beautiful lecture. I really enjoyed it. And if I may say that my favorite part of your lecture is when you speak about the form of protest and the way that we can speak up and have our voices heard. You don't always have to, there's so many ways to protest. And my heart just jumped out when you started talking about how you can protest in this way. In my case, my way to protest is education and to be there for my students. And I really enjoy, hearing you say that out loud. And I'm so proud that, our students could hear it as well. So congratulations. So more than a question, I just have a comment.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Judy. Also, that's a really nice cut.
Thank you. It comes with hard work sometimes, but I think it's important for our students to know that we make it through resilience and working hard and really usually helping others. And it really is an amazing, rewarding, let's say, profession when you can contribute in the way that we do. I'm really proud, especially of our students. Julia and Elise and those guys, they do an amazing job, and really I'm proud of them for bringing you to our community, and I welcome you. I hope I can welcome you into my classroom one day.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to come to your class. Yes.
Thank you.
If I can interject. Thank you, Wandile, and thank you to all the students for organizing this. It's interesting. I'm working with my thesis student on that in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso this semester, and I see a lot of similarities in terms of approaching this project. We are not going there to overimpose any dogmatic gesture or kind of aesthetic choice, but we are going there to understand. And the first is to recognize what is there already, to understand, decode that, and try to, in a very humble way, give our contribution what is there. And I think that it's interesting in the last pictures that you showed us, the images of your presentation, to see people across, that doesn't matter what color you are, doesn't matter what beliefs you have, religions you have, we are all together in this fight. And those are not fights that cannot be done by a specific group of people anymore. We don't go anywhere if it's just a specific group of people. These concern all of us as personas, as human beings, before them being part of certain cultural, geographical, religious community that inevitably we perhaps are, and I hope that we feel to be part of. But then bringing in the specificity of that community we belong to as a way of enriching the global one. The global one is not the one that the market or the business world tells us it is. It's this one, is what we do as people that are able to understand, decode, and reinterpret places and give our contribution to these places in a different way as educators, as architect professionals, as researchers. But that's the real globalism, what we do when we are fully immersed in those reality, more than spectator or there to judge anything. We are not for that. And I think the fact that students have and feel their responsibilities in be part of that conversation, in be proactively part of that conversation, is great. It kind of underlines the needs of a shift in our student body, that is also a shift in our profession, is a shift in our society. So we are building in this virtual, really virtual context, as this lecture tonight, the future of our society and the perspective of what the potential that the society of tomorrow can be. So I'm great that the students are embracing it and feeling that we are all fighting the same fight here. We are all on the same side. Nothing would have been possible in terms of human rights, and if everyone felt they were their own human rights. Doesn't matter who were they directly referring to, but they were also theirs. And that's, I think, is the great value of being an academic environment that is open to diversity, is open to dialogue, is open to mutual understanding. And the word that I really like for the etymology of the word is compassion, which is not anything that deals with religion. It's feel together, right? From the original etymology of the word, feel together with other people, what other people are feeling. And that's the only way that we have to be then able to say something that is meaningful and does and produce some change in the place we work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. And I totally agree. And I think it's important for us to realize that we're not bystanders, but we're active participants in curating either an inclusive society or an exclusive society. And that's why I started our conversation with this idea that we're all leaders, but how we're leading is the big question.
Thank you very much. By the way, just Wandile just wanted to tell you that this is, yes, as you noticed, particularly engaging and cross-disciplinary, because just for the introduction, Trudy Brents is our chair for interior designs, and Giovanni Santamaria is our chair for architecture of the architecture department. So it seems that also the human scale of your project has somehow creating a strong link also between these fields. It's, as Giovanni said, it's not anymore a matter of differences. It's more, well, it's a commonplace. What you showed, there is a lot. So sorry, I didn't want to speak too much because I want to leave the ground to the students, but I really find very inspiring what you are showing us. So I feel a little bit committed. Julia?
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And yeah, I think the scope of the work that I was showing shows that it's never just about the house or the church or the streets. It's about all of these things coming together. So it's not just about architecture, it's about urban design, it's about activism, it's about the economy. It's only when we work together that we're able to really start changing the systems, because they're embedded in everything from policy to this. And I think architects are quick to judge police, saying, oh, defund the police, it's the police. But in reality, in order for the police to go and focus on the south side of Chicago, someone designed those segregated neighborhoods that they work in.
I have a question. And I think that was a really interesting point that you just made. And that just made me think a little bit. But I guess maybe to get a little more general, do you have any like specific advice for students that are looking to practice socially conscious architecture in a kind of system where it kind of feels like you may enter a firm at the bottom and have a little bit less say than one may like?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. I think the only advice will sound very cliche. Stay true to who you are, right? If you truly care about bringing about change and using architecture as a vehicle for change, stay true to that. And you will thank yourself later for that. I think one of the things that I've done is I do everything I can to really, I studied architecture to use it as a vehicle to bring about change. Every time I've been pulled to use architecture for other reasons, I have felt very disconnected. But also those have been some of like the worst experiences that I've had. So I think it's rewarding to stay true to yourself. And I think the other thing for me is living without regrets, right? Knowing what you care about, knowing what you wanted to do, and then end up doing something else, maybe for an extended period of time. And then looking back when I'm, 60, and saying, oh, I could have done this, but I thought it was too hard or too tough. So I think, stay true to yourself. And of course, in certain life, here's another thing about purpose and bring about change. It evolves. As you grow, as you know more, it evolves, right? So be true to the evolution of you as you grow. So what's true today may not necessarily be what's important to you in 2 years' time. So I think that's simple. But yeah, I'm just giving it in general because I don't think there's any specific. We all have our different paths, and to get there, we have to maneuver it in different ways. But I think the most important part is just not losing yourself in that path, and just going and having grace on yourself. Sometimes you may have to take a particular job because of financial reasons, and that's okay. So you do that, but still having your end goal and seeing if you can sway things around.
I can read the questions in the chat out loud if that helps.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Sure. So I have, in the design of the spaces, what aspects of culture have you felt particularly influenced the nature of the works created in your communities? Do you feel that there's an aspect of identity that is being revealed by this work that was not erased by apartheid housing?
That's a good question. It's a good question. Yes, that's our point. It's like, when you go to the Caribbean islands, for example, and Caribbean islands, you see colonial buildings. That's what it's called. Or you go to Puerto Rico, and maybe there's an Edwardian building. I think what people are missing in that whole thing is that architecture is frozen history. I know there's a quote that says architecture is frozen music. I never understood what they meant by the quote. Maybe someone can come here and tell me. If you know what they mean, let me know. But I see architecture as frozen history, right? King Edward, who colonized this place, came and oppressed these people. And now we build houses in his name, in his honor, from England. And this is how architecture and houses should look like. Now, your child born in South Africa, growing up looking at colonial buildings, Edwardian buildings, Victorian buildings, are directly being taught to value that Western architecture is the way to go and it's more valuable, and indigenous architecture is primitive and not important. But in addition to that, there's a messed up psychology there. It's like, oh, like, you know, if I had a child and they're looking at all these colonial buildings, like, Dad, like, where did the Edwardian buildings come from? Who's Edward? Like, yeah, he's the guy who came and destroyed this country and brought in colonialism and racism, and now we celebrate him through building buildings that acknowledge, you know, his legacy. So, as you saw in our particular building, it's like, how do we take architectural principles and start bringing back to life some of those indigenous design methods, which are actually very sustainable, like grass thatch, mud brick homes, etc. But again, what happened was African architecture was stifled when colonization happened. So over 400, 500 years now, African architecture didn't have the opportunity to evolve the same way Baroque, Renaissance, you know, has had. So now we need to fill in the gap between, you know, Rondevel roundhouses and 2022, which is a huge gap. So this is our attempt at what that looks like. You know, people like Francis Carey are obviously doing an incredible job at reinterpreting that as well.
And then we have another question in the chat. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience as an Obama leader? How has this position helped to inform your work?
Yeah, being an Obama leader. I think what being an Obama leader has done, it has made people respond to my emails. So that helps. It obviously definitely comes with a certain level of, you know, clout where people are willing to listen to you more. And obviously learning from and meeting President Obama, is a huge privilege, and learning from within that group about leadership, and then the network of other young leaders who are doing amazing work, and just having a tad more access to networks and resources to help you further the work. Yeah. So like, even if things are not going well, just remembering that Obama still co-signs your work, you know, makes you at least feel better.
I want to leave a second if anybody else wants to ask a question. Go ahead. Okay, I have another one.
Yeah.
What is the best way to supplement existing DEI policies and principles in a way that is effective and helpful to becoming more than just architectural practice?
So let me get the question right. Are you saying, how do we have effective DEI policies and practices rather than the virtue signaling ones?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think it comes down to culture again, because policies are what you write down. You can write that down and put it on a shelf, right? But also how those policies come about, who writes them. So if you're the CEO and your woke management writes the policies and then just put them on the shelf. There's no buy-in from the employees. Those policies don't mean anything. And I think that's why the changing of culture, this idea of the narrative structure of story itself, story of us and story of others is very important. We need to first go at the roots of why are you even writing those DEI policies? Why are we doing it? Why do they matter to me? And why do they matter to our work? Right? And if you can get your staff and everyone on board in understanding why this is important first, only then are you then going to be able to have effective policies. And then from there, you need some continuous learning. We call those cooking classes with the anti-racist hotdog, where folks continue to learn about tools and skills. Because I think what is important for us to understand is that we are born into a very racist, a very sexist, a very homophobic world, and we can't change that. But how do we then, coming from these very harsh backgrounds, come to a workplace and create a safe haven for each other, a sense of belonging and well-being? So that takes work, that takes learning. And how do we create structures that encourage those processes? And the whole thing with race and injustice, it's a shifting target, right? Black Lives Matter, then now it's Asian hate, and then now it's anti-Russian hate, etc. So the world constantly shows us what it is, right? But how do we then respond and create environments of inclusion?
Can I ask a question? It's not about question, it's more like about kind of dilemma we face these days. I'm an architecture historian. We try to teach global history, and then we try to cover African history as well. But at the same time, what is happening last like couple of decades, the story of African architecture history is written by white male again, white people again. And then it's funded by, government or big university, grants, but instead of giving the opportunity to locals, it's like in the name of diversity, it's actually, the story itself is created by, strangers, like outsiders as well. And we recognize Francis Kerr or other people, but even architecture history books, the majority of buildings on African context actually built by white people as well. Because when you talk about modern architecture, and people try to follow the genealogy of modern architecture. So they try to go, someone was trained by Le Corbusier, someone was trained by Berlin, in Berlin, that kind of story. So it's a difficult situation, but how you feel about this whole, push about diversity, different story, but at the same time, isn't there some kind of risk as well? I get the impression, I attend many historians meetings, but in many cases, I am the only person, almost the only person of color. I face several situations, and I'm not even African. They talk about Latin American history, African architecture history, and then I am the only one. Does it make sense?
It does. Oh man, this is a good question. This is a great question. I think it's funny that you go to these conferences on diversity and history and stuff, and you're the only person of color there. And by default, even when they talk to African architecture, you're the next best person to look at as the topic comes up. Again, I think, look, it goes back to intentional work versus virtue signaling, right? So there's a lot of virtue signaling around DEI and around such topics as African architecture. Because in your question, you already hinted that there's a very simple solution here. there's a lot of brilliant African students and African architects and African professors who can be funded by these same institutions to develop a narrative on their own history. But that's not happening.
Yeah, that's exactly my point, right?
Yeah.
That's a scary part. The stories are like created by others again. There will be mainstream stories. And big state universities are like big, like, research universities funding money, lots of like scholars, Harvard, Columbia, Yale, all different places, like producing scholars on Africa, on Latin America. They wouldn't fund like a local African students or scholars.
Sure.
So that's kind of, yeah, go ahead.
No. I think this is important. This is important because it helps us better understand racism. So, there was a presentation that was happening at a Fortune 500 company, and this lady, they talk about racism and bias, and she raises her hand and says, well, I'm having a hard time buying this narrative on racism, etc. Because I just don't believe that, people can be so malicious in doing things, right? And again, but that's what keeps the system in place. It's us believing in the myth that everyone comes in with good intentions and the system is a meritocracy that enables all of us to succeed. No, it was never designed that way, and it's not. So what you find happening is that the requirements to get those funding from Harvard, from Yale, from these different top institutions are almost impossible for any African students who are applying, right? And as a result, they're like, well, we have it open to everyone, but only a certain type of people are the ones who are making the cut, right? Which is ironic because, like, well, if you're going to really focus on designing a program for African architecture, why don't you shape the requirements based on what works within African students and how do you draw that from that particular pool? So it's all these systems that are built in place. And I think this is one last very important point to this is that you can care about Black people and Asian people and people of color and live your life, right? And not be racist. But that doesn't mean that those people aren't subjugated to racism, independent of you. And then number two, that doesn't mean you're not contributing towards that racism because you're enjoying the privileges of being the in-group during that process, because you can choose not to care. You can choose not to have to worry about it. I can't choose not to fight racism in some way, form, or shape. I have to, right? So that's why this idea, it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist, which is actively fight against the system. So that's how I feel about the whole African scholars, and I think it's something that we need to change. And I also had a problem, particularly with Francis Gehry. I remember when I was in college, he studied, I think, in Germany, and he opened his office there. And when I was in college, to apply to his firm, you needed to know how to speak German, for example. You had to speak German, one, and then number two, his firm was like 95% white. So it was fascinating to me. It's like, well, even our own people, when they get there, creating those barriers. But I also understood it. For him to rise up in the social rankings within architecture in that particular space, he had to make certain compromises in that particular way. So this goes to show how all these structures sort of work. And that's why when I started the multi-design group and the work that I'm doing, I was very intentional about rooting it in Africa, having the offices there, hiring local architecture students, interns and recent grads, etc., and trying to bring about, part of that change. Of course, that's not the glamorous work that particularly wins awards, but I think it's a step in the right direction where we become the change that we want to see.
I don't know if I add one. I had a very weird experience years ago. There was a scholar, a friend of mine, and she was like African specialist, Senegal mainly. And then she had a summer program with a group of like, American students going to Senegal. Their goal was solving housing problems in Senegal. And then like you take second year architecture students who are now really, who don't have much knowledge, right? And then going to Senegal with good intention. That good intention was funded by the school. Then she went, but there are people who are very well educated in Western society or like regionally. And then there are people who worked really hard to solve housing problems there for decades, probably 700 years continuously. And then like at school, what I felt so crazy was, the school actually advertised in the newspaper and then website, sending about 10 white kids to Africa to solve a housing problem of the country. And then they celebrated. So like sometimes I get the impression that, funding issue is kind of similar issue. We are like somehow internalizing this kind of like racism, not direct, but it's a deep racism of control, like undermining, underestimating others. They are always like higher, like no respect for the like people who try to like solve problems. I don't know. I was like, but that's like somehow like sometimes it's a very much in American academia. I think like Western academia in general, like solving problems, creating stories for you, and then how can you stop these? That's like sometimes like I ask myself, how can you stop it? Like probably I can do through history, talking about like different images of different stories of Africa. And then, but in the studio, how can you do that? Or in different places, how can you do that? In architecture school, that has been my question. Yeah, that's true. Tarzan has been
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this happens a lot. Also, I just want to say this man is preaching. Everything you're saying is 100% correct, and I'm glad that you see it for what it actually is. This is true with also like missionaries, right? Who go to build a one-day classroom or one-day church, and they've never held a hammer in their lives. They take a selfie and then they post it on Instagram. They get social capital in the West as this humanitarian, but it actually causes more damage than good. I think I wrote an article actually addressing this particular issue because I've been on both sides of that phenomenon. When I was in high school in Zimbabwe, we had a group of missionaries who were 80, and the youngest was 15 and the oldest was like 86, who came to build this one day classroom. And we had to like, they disrupted, we had to like stop school and welcome them and entertain them and all this stuff. And they built this one day classroom, and it was literally a shack. It was the worst building on campus, and it was not built on one day. It ended up taking like 2 or 3 weeks to build this out of corrugated metal, and it's just a useless building. And I was a building student in that high school. We literally were taught how to build. And I was just thinking to myself, I was young, I was like in grade 9, I was thinking to myself, like, well, it cost about $1,000 to fly to South Africa, or to Zimbabwe at the time, at least $1,000. And so that's like, for 80 people, that's like $80,000. And then all the money for lodging and food and visiting Victoria Falls and all of this. When you add all of that money up, we could have built several high quality classrooms and churches, etc. locally. And then when I went to Andrews, I was passing by and there was these people who were advertising this missionary trip to Mexico and to sort of like these different places. I was like, oh, so these are the people. This is how this works. And I went on two of these trips, one to Bolivia, and then I went on another one to Mexico, and I saw it. I was like, oh, I got to sort of experience both ends of this. Now, listen, I think there is an opportunity for students from around the world to come to Africa and learn, right? But that's a different narrative, coming to Africa to learn versus coming to Africa to provide solutions to African problems that you think you know better. And I think that's the fundamental problem. And again, there's this Western narrative of being a savior and coming in and sort of like saving the day. And even with the project that I did, obviously, in South Africa, and I worked with Andrews University, they continued to do other projects in Swaziland, etc. And one of my biggest clashes with them was that same narrative, like how it's being done. You know? But yeah, I agree. This white savior mentality is definitely deeply problematic, and even more results into more harm than actually good for the local community. Coming to learn versus coming in as an expert are two very different things.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't see one more question in the chat. I think we may be good to wrap it up here. I think that's a really good note to end on, unless anybody else has any questions they want to ask.
I do have one question. Sorry, I couldn't speak before. There was so much noise in the background, but thank you for answering my first question. So with that in mind, how do you, I don't know if my mic is, excuse me. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so with that in mind, how do you deal with these institutions that come? I mean, I'm sure you have had to interact with them that want to come, and since you have the Obama co-signature, they probably want to come and piggyback or associate with you for, as you say, various reasons. How do you deal with that when they come and ask you to participate or to sign off on some project they want to do to have their name in the right place?
A good question. Number one, they haven't come.
Okay.
But if they were to come, we would put them through the whole anti-racist product experience, focusing on anti-racism and education around that. And then through the stir of others, collaborate with them in doing social impact and social justice work in South Africa, where we and local South Africans are the lead, and they are learning and part of the process. Yeah,
do you have any particular advice? I mean, just before you leave, do you have any particular advice for our students who are interested in being, well, socially just, for want of a better word? Any simple, you may have answered this already. I came in late, so please forgive if I'm repeating.
No, you good. Yeah, I think it relates to what I was talking to Julia about, to stay true to the course, that it's obviously a bumpier road than the traditional path, but an ultimately more fulfilling and rewarding one in the long run. And you know, I'm always there as a resource if they have any particular questions. But yeah, just stay true to the course and continue to learn. And again, I think focusing on learning and growing and collaborating with others rather than coming in as an expert is fundamental in the process of bringing about social change and impact.
Thank you. Well said.
Thank you all for having me. I had a great time. I am glad I did not fall asleep because it's like midnight here. But thank you all. And I wish you the best of luck as you continue to do amazing work within this space.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot, Wandile. We appreciate
Possibly.
you.
Thank you.